Ina mana ina reo na karanga maha o te wā tihi Māori ora. E nā rangatira, karanga mai, mihi mai, whakatau mai, tēnā koutou katoa. So good morning and thank you for this opportunity to join you today. And I also just wanted to congratulate the organisers of the conference, Richard, Robert and team, for putting together such an awesome program over the last 3 days. So I'm down as the regulatory keynote speech this morning, and I'm very happy to take questions on that when I sit down with Rachel. But I thought that given that we released the monetary policy statement just yesterday afternoon, I'd just kick off with a few opening comments about the economy and the economic outlook from here, which we've obviously already sort of touched on this morning. So when I joined this conference around this time last year, CPI inflation across the OECD countries was running at 10% and not really showing any sign of abating at that point. We were very much still in the eye of the storm when it came to dealing with the aftermath of a global pandemic and the invasion of the Ukraine. And it was very much, the story was a very, very large imbalance that had been created with not only resilient but actually quite robust demand and spending across the global economy being met by an inability to deliver on that, given the severe supply constraints that were being felt worldwide. And that was really the context in which at the Reserve Bank we put the interest rates up 12 times in a row over the course of an 18-month period, quite often in quite quick, large clips. And I've got to say it's been a pretty uncomfortable time to be a central banker, not only having inflation outside of our target range, but also having the knowledge that monetary policy, we have blunt tools that have long and variable lags. So you never know for absolute sure whether you've done enough or whether you've done too much. So yesterday we left the official cash rate unchanged at 5.5%, as you would have picked up. And a key, message that was underlying that was a growing confidence that we are seeing that divergence between demand and supply abating. We are seeing that gap closing. So on the demand side of the economy, we're seeing the interest rate sensitive parts of the economy increasingly respond to the increases in the OCR that we've done to date. We initially last year saw house prices falling, asset prices falling more generally. This year that story's progressed into one of softening consumption, more subdued construction activity, and a slowing more generally in business activity. At the same time, we've seen those constraints on the supply side of the economy starting to abate. And again, the story has sort of progressed on that front. So last year it was a story very much about those disruptions to supply chains starting to abate and free up. This year that's translated into falling shipping costs, falling commodity prices, energy prices. And the story has also progressed into this year where not only are we seeing a freeing up of the goods markets, but also a freeing up of the movement of people around the globe. And so you would have seen the very strong increase we've had in net migration and the effect that that's had on our labour market. So if you ask businesses 12 months ago, what is the biggest constraint on your business? The answer was lack of labour. Now we look across a range of different measures of the labour market, and the vast majority of them are moving the right direction into a more sustainable level. So you add that all up, more subdued demand, a freeing up of supply. We are seeing inflation pressures now starting to abate. We've had headline inflation peaking, but over 7% is now heading south. inflation expectations, importantly moving in the right direction towards our target. What we haven't seen so far is a sustained fall in sort of core measures of inflation, and that's not too surprising because they tend to be the last thing to go in that sort of story that I've told about how the transmission of monetary policy works its way through. So we're expecting that to come. But it is also one of the reasons why we've signalled that we think we'll have to keep monetary policy restrictive for some time yet, just to really get that evidence coming through and get that high degree of confidence that we need. So that's the sort of central story of the way that we see the economy at the moment and the role that we need to play in it. What are the things that are keeping us awake at night? Well, in the near term, and by which that I mean over the next couple of months, it's that inflation remains sticky and that inflation pressures coming back takes a little longer than we expected. And we already know data's volatile. There are a few one-off factors such that we think actually the next CPI outturn might be a bit higher than that underlying downward trend. If you look out over the medium term, the way that we see the risks balanced there are very much more to the downside. And I know that people have talked about it already this morning, the dark clouds sort of brewing internationally, the risk that the slowdown in China is sharper and more protracted than we expect, and the implications that would have for here for us in New Zealand. So that's the sort of balance of risks. The good news is that monetary policy is a repeat game. We get to meet again in 6 weeks and see how things play out there. But until then, we're in a sort of comfortable position of being able to watch, worry and wait until we meet again. So kia kaha, kia maia, kia manua nui, kia ora koutou katoa. I'll just finish it up there and take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Have a seat. 1, 2, that one would be just next one over. Thank you. Thank you so much. I guess first question I think I would have for you, off the back of what Christopher Luxon has just announced, in particular around the 2 acts that he wants to roll back, so the CCCFA designed to restrict predatory lenders and the CFIA to manage financial conduct. How does the central bank view that, do you think? Well, I should say, how does Christian Hawkesby view that?
Yeah, well, I was very interested by those comments, as you could expect. Those 2 bits of legislation are led by the Commerce Commission when it comes to the CCCFA and the FMA when it comes to COFI. Where we fit into that picture is the Deposit Taker Act, which is working its way through. I mean, the way I see those bits of legislation are been a process of modernising our regulatory framework. You know, one where we've either had pieces of our regulatory framework missing, you know, the absence of a conduct regime, which is very standard internationally, and we've learnt, you know, a lot of lessons about the failures of conduct. You know, think back to the Royal Commission in Australia and all of those things. It's 5 years ago now, but it's still, a key memory in people's minds. Those things are about modernising our framework, where if we don't have it, or in the case of the Reserve Bank, you know, our framework for regulating depositors is 30 years old, and we just don't have the tools that a modern regulator needs. Right,
maybe modernise or improve those acts perhaps would have been a better option?
Well, and take the Deposit Taker Act, you know, we've got very limited tools. We can register banks and we can deregister banks, which is a sort of a nuclear option. What you really want in a regulatory regime is a sort of a gradation of different tools and responsibilities you have right across enforcement, resolution, all of those things, and a coherent package.
I'm going to ask some questions. I've got my app working, people, so feel free to send your questions through. Here's one that's come through. Other than the OCR, what's another economic management tool that the RBNZ would like to have to manage inflation, and why?
We're quite happy with, we think that, the official cash rate, interest rates, they do work. And it's what central banks are all about. We're ultimately a bank to the banking system and a bank to the government. And so our role is, as a banker, setting those interest rates to get the inflation outcomes that we require. So we think that interest rates work, they're potent, they don't affect the economy evenly. It's important that monetary policy works in tandem with broader government policy. If there are distributional issues, there are other arms of government that can support in that front. An important part for us in terms of the tools that we need a strong balance sheet. We need lots of capital. We need to have the ability to not only shift interest rates around, but if interest rates are very low, we need the ability to do additional types of monetary policy actions such as quantitative easing when it's required.
Do you think we should be potentially looking at moving that 1% to 3%? Is that a realistic target, do you think, for inflation still?
So it's, we were the first country in the world to have an inflation target. Other countries have followed. They've all coalesced around a midpoint of 2%. We had our monetary policy remit review last year, actually published the results of that early this year. There's a lot of consultation around that. We couldn't come up with a better number than a midpoint of 2%. It helps kind of grease the wheels of the economy, but keep things low and stable.
A couple of quick questions here. Do you think it would be beneficial to report inflation monthly, as they do in some jurisdictions overseas? Would this enable better use of the OCR?
I think sort of people get that question and they think intuitively more data, better decision making, you've got a clearer idea of the economy, you're not having to wait as long, all of that stuff. And I'd agree with that. It's subject to that being good quality, data. So if we're getting a really volatile monthly number, is that actually going to result in better decision making? So a more frequent, high quality, accurate number, yes, would be fantastic. Okay,
you've ratcheted up rates to cool the economy. What's the outlook for unemployment?
So our projections have unemployment heading north from here, a little over 5%. The way that we're kind of seeing it more is we really need to look at a broad range of measures of the labour market. There is this inclination to go, well, unemployment is the summary statistic in the same way that CPI inflation is for the price level. We look at a range of different measures. The one that I think that really has stood out over the last year or so has been the difficulty finding skilled and unskilled labour. And that one has been absolutely off the charts. And you think, well, if we want to get back to a more sustainable labour market, more sustainable maximum employment, that has to come down.
Right. Let's talk about migration then, and what are you seeing? What impact is that having?
It's a really complex one for us because it works through these different, channels. It's been very much a good news story in the sense of freeing up the labour market. That's one of the channels it works through. More workers really eases that pressure. We've done some research to show that actually it helps even more when you've got such a tight labour market as it has. We've done some research around the composition of those migrants, and that has been very supportive to the labour market. At the same time, there's a demand effect too. These people need to be housed. They need to, need everything that we need: infrastructure, food, all the rest of it. So there is a demand pressure there as well. Yeah. For now, the supply side has been very prominent, but things will work their way through.
Central banks around the world, they've dished out some pretty tough medicine. I think interest rates here, they're the highest since about 2008, I think. Economists are suggesting that you possibly start to cut second quarter, some suggesting a little earlier. I've got messages coming through here. What is the OCR interest rate forecast for the next 12 months?
Yeah, so we put out a projection every 3 months. The projection that we put out this time was pretty similar to 3 months ago, because that story is sort of progressing largely as expected. That projection's consistent with us keeping the official cash rate where it is well into next year, really just to get that evidence that things have turned as we need. But that's the central projection. There are a wide range, and people forget this very quickly, that our projections never turn out exactly as we say, and so there is a wide range of uncertainty around that, and that projection will move. Every 3 months it will move around as the data moves.
How do you think we're tracking when you compare us with our key trading partners?
We spend a lot of time talking to our colleagues internationally. It's almost like a peer support group. We're all going through the same thing. We're all dealing with this big imbalance. It's a global thing. We're all in the spotlight. There's a high degree of scrutiny around what we're doing. For a while there, we were putting interest rates up 6 months ahead of others and wondering, what are they up to? Are they seeing something that we aren't? I think we're pleased that we've lifted interest rates, as fast as we have, because in a sense, it's a challenge you need to get on top of. If you don't put up interest rates sooner, you end up having to do more work later. And we've seen, other countries such as the UK find themselves in that position where they were, slow to move initially, wanting to, balance the trade-off a bit differently, and then having to do more work later. So we're comfortable. We think we're in a good position now.
Some concerns, and certainly there's been conversations in this room about China. How does the Reserve Bank view the situation there? Fundamentally important to New Zealand.
It's definitely at the top of our worry list in terms of the outlook from here. China has slowed, and there are a whole lot of factors that headwinds it's facing, both cyclically, structurally, and the geopolitical challenges there as well. In the past, they've turned to some policy tools, freeing up their credit markets, promoting sort of investment and construction. There's some hesitancy about using those tools now, given the debt levels that have built up predominantly in the sort of local government sector. At the same time, Chinese consumers are feeling pretty hesitant too, even when they're being encouraged to go out and spend. They're putting more into their savings. So there's all of these things to grapple with. We're conscious that China is a large part of our export earnings, so that is the main thing we're watching at the moment.
I appreciate the apolitical nature of the Reserve Bank. Nonetheless, a few questions coming in from the floor. I will put this one to you from Sam. What do you think about National wanting to return the Reserve Bank to having a singular monetary policy objective on inflation?
Yeah, so the Reserve Bank's operationally independent, but that means that we're operationally independent to fulfil the objective that's set for us by the government of the day. So ultimately, we will do whatever the government of the day puts out there. Previously, we had a sole inflation target, and we've moved to a dual target. We've said that over the course of the last 4 or 5 years that we've had that change, our policy settings wouldn't have been materially different. And the reason is that if you go into this sort of COVID-19 period, we were worried about a deep recession. We were worried about deep deflation. Both of those things are telling you to go, in the same direction. And equally, as we've come out of COVID, we've had a very tight labour market. We've had a very high inflation pressures. Both of those things are telling you to go in that same direction. With the remit review, which I talked about earlier, we consulted about what our remit should be, and the advice that we gave to the minister was having what we called a hierarchical approach, which is to say that inflation has prominence as over maximum sustainable employment. In a way, the way our objective is set sort of does that already, in the sense of inflation. It's a specific number, it's a specific measure, there's a specific range, and with the labour market, it's about contributing to this sort of broad concept of maximum sustainable employment. So it has that sort of secondary nature by the way it's described.
One quick question that's come in again, this one from Alan. Are you frustrated at what you've been dealing with in terms of trying to get the inflationary pressure under control? Fair to say, been a good chunk of government spending.
I think that the government of the day has to play the hand that it's dealt with as well. We're not the fiscal advisor. That's the role of the Treasury. The government. We've been dealing with pandemics and wars and cyclones. The government has been as well with its fiscal policy, and I think people quickly forget about the weather events earlier this year and the way that that's had to just naturally adjust and change what our government policy is and the fiscal outlook from here. For us, we know inflation, our actions take time to work their way through. We're always very much focused on the medium term. That's where we need to keep our focus. And when we look into the medium term, the last budget that the government put out had government consumption and expenditure falling as a proportion of potential output. So that's what really matters for us, that we need to see that.
You're talking about the floods. One final question for you, Christian. Can you comment on the impact on the New Zealand economy of the recent climate disasters from your perspective?
It's it's just a real wake-up call that, I was a fund manager in my previous life, and the whole ESG investing and the climate and things were really just a niche thing that people talked about. It's just so mainstream now. It's so accepted that this is a global challenge that we're facing. Climate change is a key part of what we do. Responding to climate change. For the Reserve Bank, it's very much front and centre when it comes to our regulatory role. Our conversations with the banks and insurers about how they're preparing, what stress tests are they doing. We've published some of those recently.
Preparing for the prevalence of potentially another major event like this.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you think about stress testing. We've been doing stress testing for years. Historically, it was on the banking sector, and it was all about, can you cope with this level of interest rates or this level of unemployment? Now our stress tests are on the banking system and on the life insurance sector, and can you cope with that macroeconomic scenario as well as this climate scenario and that climate scenario? It is very central to being in the financial services industry.
Can see why you need your peer support group on the phone.
Absolutely.
There's a bit going on. Christian Hawkesby, very much appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel.